I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005, and I raised my own LSAT score from a 152 to a 175. I coached several different students on their biggest LSAT challenges, and I did my best to make my answers to them as tactical and concrete as possible so that you can apply them to your LSAT prep.
It's scary knowing that my test is in a month. I'm scared I don't have enough time for it. My biggest struggle is timing, and I freak out on the test itself. So what's the best strategy to just calm down? Because I'm really scared, and it's it's the end of the world for me. And it's so bad that I think this way.
Yeah, that's a big thing. So there's a lot of ways you can approach that. And one of them would be to think about, while the LSAT as a whole is incredibly important, no one particular test date will make or break you. You can retake. Retaking is totally fine. People do improve significantly. And if you don't improve significantly, maybe it's because you didn't change your prep approach. But there are ways to significantly improve on a retake with another month or two. Even if you didn't change your understanding at all, through luck alone, you could do a few points better. And then if you studied a ton over that next month or two, you could do astronomically better. And law schools only take the highest score. So there's a lot of reason to retake.
Reading comp and logical reasoning, that's the time constraint that really scares me.
I would say blast through the easier questions. Trust your gut on those. They're not really trying to trip you up majorly on those for the most part. I typically divide LSAT prep into 3 major phases: accuracy, pacing, and endurance. Accuracy is drilling questions by type and establishing a strong foundation. Pacing is doing individual timed sections to work on how you allocate your time over the course of the section. And endurance is doing full-length timed practice tests to build up your stamina. Now, if you're struggling with time management, if you're feeling anxiety around timing, I would probably recommend spending a bit more time on the pacing and endurance phases of your prep in order to get to the point where taking a full exam on test day itself is like just another run through, because you've done it all before and you already have your own internal sense of your pacing, how you're going to allocate your time over the course of this section. In reading comprehension, that could be how you allocate time between reading the passage, taking any notes, and then solving the questions associated. In logical reasoning, it comes down to how you allocate your time over the course of the 25 or so individual bite-sized questions throughout the section. Keeping in mind that there is a general order of difficulty in logical reasoning, the earlier questions are going to be easier than the harder questions, and so you want to solve the earlier questions faster to build up a time bank that you could then later apply to the tougher questions towards the end of the section. For anyone aiming for a 160 or 165 plus, I typically recommend trying to solve the first 10 questions in roughly 10 to 12 minutes to build up that time bank that you can then apply to the tougher questions that truly need it. Maybe you're flagging 3 or 4 of them when you encounter them in the middle of the section, and you're circling back at the end to tackle them. If you were in the 140s, I would also want to make sure that you have a strong foundation in everything they're testing you on now. So you said you were at 141 before. Where are you at the moment now in terms of where you think you might be scoring on a practice test?
So I'm currently taking a practice test this week, but I'm taking it in sections. I don't want to take it all at once because I freak out. I think I'm gonna do well on this practice exam because I have been practicing more on logical reasoning. Reading comp I haven't done a lot of practice on because I'm like, there's this strategy and I have to work on it. I know your strategy is not to take notes and just to memorize everything and keep it in your head and have that anticipation on the author's attitude, the main point. I find it really hard to do that. So I don't know what the best thing to do because I've tried both ways and I do the same.
The best thing is whatever works for you. So try out a handful of passages one way, try out a handful of passages the other way, and see what you like best. And there may even be more than 2 ways. The reading comp workshop I did a few weeks ago, we went into different ways you could go about it. Do you highlight? Do you not? Do you underline? Do you not? Do you take simple summaries of the paragraphs? Do you take more detailed notes? Or do you take no notes at all? I find that the students who do the best on reading comp tend to mark very little and maybe not even anything at all, for the reason that it takes time to write things down, it takes time to read things, and what you write down, the notes that you take, oftentimes end up not even being useful to help you solve the questions later. Also, the highlighting and underlining tools in the online LSAT are pretty glitchy and imprecise. In other words, they're unreliable, and you don't want to waste time fiddling with them given that the test is strictly timed. Instead, maybe take just a few notes on your scratch paper, noting what is the main idea, primary purpose, author's opinion, and leave it at that.
I've been trying to set up a schedule for myself. It's been hard because I work full-time, and that's the most challenging part of it.
So how many hours a week are you looking to put in?
I want to do 6 hours a day.
Okay, so what happens when you try to do the studying afterward?
It's just like I can't focus. It's the opposite from the morning when I'm starting with a fresh mind. I think I definitely need to take a break for 1 or 2 hours after work and then get ready in that period of time. Just get ready. It's mindset for the next hours of study.
I can sense your dedication. I mean, you started off saying 6 hours of LSAT study and the full-time job. And so I want to explore for you, can we achieve the 6 hours? And if not, can it still be okay?
We can achieve the 6 hours, but also I think that if we do not, it's okay because I'm not rushing in taking the LSAT.
LSAT prep is a marathon, not a sprint, and you don't want to burn out before you've hit your peak. Keep in mind that if you have other obligations while you're studying for the LSAT, like work or school or family obligations, you might not be able to put in as much time per day as someone who has the leisure to do nothing but study for the LSAT. You don't want to burn the candle at both ends and study when you're fatigued because you're not going to get as much out of it, and it could even be counterproductive. So 6 hours a day of LSAT prep on top of a full-time job, especially if you're commuting, just might not be realistic. Of course, if you want to put in 6 hours a day on weekends or a day off from work, that's totally fine. But on work days, it might be that you could do only a max of, say, 4 hours, 2 hours before work, 2 hours after work, or maybe 1 hour before, 1 hour after, and you're squeezing in an hour or two in the middle of the workday during lunch or during some downtime. And you might need a slightly longer time frame to get to your goal score if you're working full-time versus if you weren't, and that's okay. All that matters is you get the score in the end. That's what schools are going to care about, not so much when you took it. And it's much better to apply a little bit later with a higher score than earlier with a lower score. And of course, if you already have a lower score on record, don't be afraid to retake. Law schools don't average multiple scores, but rather they only take the highest score. You're dedicated. You want to put in 6 hours on top of a full-time job. I still want to explore with you if that can be achieved, and if so, how. What's the quality of the hours that you're going to get? Because you started off the conversation saying the morning hours are fantastic.
Yeah.
The evening hours are kind of draining,
well,
and maybe you're not getting what you want from those.
Well, I guess I'm going to have to figure that out.
To me, this is the fundamental question for you, Belen, because this question will then dictate what you end up doing and how you spread it out. My typical recommendation for those who are not working full-time is max 6 hours a day of LSAT prep.
Okay, so you're saying that I shouldn't do 6 hours?
That's my inclination. Okay. I'm kind of hesitant to recommend that or leave the conversation without.
I mean, that makes sense. That makes sense. I mean, 6 hours a day with a full-time job is a lot. It's a lot. Instead of 6 hours, maybe do 4 hours a day.
It sounds better to me. To me. I didn't want to just start off the conversation telling you it's a bad idea, because I wanted to actually explore with you a little bit of what could that really look like? How is it possible to do everything you need for a top LSAT, which also includes the sleep, diet, exercise, and relaxation? What happens to your sleep as a result? What happens to your mindset as a result? What happens to your eating? Are you getting outside enough? All of these things are important to consider, because even if you put in the hours, the quality of your life and the quality of your results may suffer.
I'm trying to take it seriously, so I put a lot of pressure on me. Like, I need to do 6 hours. I have to do them. So I think that's what it is.
You also might not need to study 6 hours a day if you're studying the right way. One thing that my students find incredibly valuable is to have a personalized day-by-day study plan breaking down exactly what to do every single day from now till the test. And so when you're sitting down for those LSAT study sessions, whether it's in the evening after work or before work or on the weekends, you want to be ready to go knowing exactly what to do. Are you drilling questions by type? Are you doing timed sections? Are you taking full-length exams? which exams, which sections. Having it all mapped out in advance will make it that much easier to actually put in the time rather than facing procrastination or spinning your wheels figuring out what to do rather than actually doing it. So map it out in advance so that when you get home from work, you're ready to start. Also, a lot of my students find that it's harder to study once they're at home after work rather than in their work environment, maybe in the office, in a conference room, or at a coffee shop nearby. So you might want to bring your LSAT materials with you to work so that you can knock out an hour or two before you get home and start unwinding for the evening.
I'm going over the time limit. I'm also I'm falling for a lot of traps. When there's a timer on, I start reading through the options really fast, and any option that resembles what could be an answer, I pick and move on. And that leads me to pick a lot of traps. And I just want to know if there's a way to study particularly for the logical reasoning exams.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And so it sounds like maybe the review process for logical reasoning would be useful for you. What does your review process look like right now?
I'm not going to be honest, I don't do this for every single question I get it right, but for every question I get wrong, I look at it and I see why I made a mistake. So I would just read their prompts and try writing down certain notes right next to the questions.
Okay, so explanations are good, but you don't want to use them as a crutch. The first step after you get something wrong or you have difficulty with something is to engage in your own review process, analyzing your own thoughts.
Right.
So for logical reasoning, the framework I recommend for this is called the Socratic review method. And the Socratic review method is a way to really get to the root of where your misunderstanding stemmed from. Was it in the stimulus? Was it in the question stem? Or was it in the answer choices? If it was in the stimulus, you want to figure out what it was about the method of reasoning that made it more difficult for you. Maybe they buried the conclusion in the middle. Maybe they require you to take the contrapositive. Maybe they used annoying words like unless, except, until, or without. Or maybe it's just on a topic that pre-law students typically don't like science.
Right, okay.
You've got to walk before you can run. And in the context of the LSAT, that means you got to slow down to speed up by understanding the stimulus. First and foremost, the question stem and the answer choices only make sense in the context of the stimulus. So if you don't even know what the stimulus is saying, if you don't understand the argument, the choices will only further confuse you. And so as an exercise, as a drill, you might want to go through an entire section of logical reasoning, simply rewriting, paraphrasing the arguments in your own words as if you were going to explain them to a 5-year-old. Once you understand them, then you can start applying a little bit more time pressure to allocate your time over the course of the section, making sure you can finish the questions in the time allotted. But if you're not understanding what you're reading and you're still getting lots of questions wrong and you're still running out of time, you might need to slow down first and focus on accuracy before you switch gears and focus on pacing.
So when you're reading the logical reasoning, like a prompt, would you read the stimulus first or question first? Because you told me that you read the question first, and I've only been reading the stimulus first, then moving on to the question, then moving on to my answer choices. And if I'm not satisfied with any of my answer choices, then I go back to the stimulus to see if I can get more information than to match a possible answer choice. How would you recommend I go about that process?
I prefer question stem first. Others prefer stimulus first. Ultimately, it's not really that big a deal. And since you're aiming to take the LSAT in the summer, you've got plenty of time to try out both styles, both approaches, and see what works better for you. Personally, I like question stem first because it shows me the perspective from which to view the stimulus, whether I'm looking for gaps or not. So for example, in a must be true question or most strongly supported, I'm not concerned with gaps in an argument. And in fact, it may simply be a fact set. But in other cases like flaw or strengthen or weaken, the gap is incredibly important to focus on.
Right. So your strategies are completely different for the type of questions you're reading rather than having one preset strategy that you're going to apply to every single question.
Exactly. I mean, there's over a dozen different types of logical reasoning questions, and they all require different approaches and different perspectives.
Right. I feel like even though I read all these concepts, when it comes to taking a section or doing a practice test, I feel like when you're competing against time, it's hard to apply each one of these concepts perfectly to every single one of these questions. Would that come with practice, or would that come with, doing questions untimed, then getting a feel for it, then moving on, like timing your sections, then taking a practice? How would you recommend that?
It's all valuable work, and it does take time as well. The LSAT's an incredibly difficult exam, and It requires building the foundation first. And the framework underlying my LSAT study plans is what I call the laser approach to LSAT studying: learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. So learning is the theory, accuracy is questions by type, S is for sections, individual timed 35-minute sections, E is for exams and endurance, and R is for review. So each of these things has their place. Questions by type has its place. Reviewing concepts and building the foundation has its place. And then pulling it all together with full-length exams also has its place. And so it's all valuable. And I think a mix of all of this is important.
So in logical reasoning, questions that are similar in concept to the stimulus, but they're innately different, but like an answer choice is based on the other concept. So those kind of questions really trip me up, because it's hard to recognize those answer choices from the right answer choices. Is there a trick to going about those type of questions?
Yeah, sure. And so when you're referring to like really tempting wrong answers and discouraging right answers, one of the things you want to be looking at as you engage in your review process is what was tempting about the wrong answer choice that made you pick it or consider it, and what ultimately makes it wrong, and what is discouraging about the right answer that pushed you away from it and made it seem unappealing. And these are things you want to articulate for yourself. And looking at explanations, this is really where it becomes a crutch, because it prevents you from engaging in your own analysis here. And so you talk this out with a friend, a study buddy, a coach, a tutor, or just writing it out in a journal. But put it in your own words before you look at other sources. It's an age-old debate in the LSAT prep world. Should you read the question stem first in logical reasoning, or should you read the stimulus first in logical reasoning? I've tried it both ways myself. Back when I was studying for the LSAT, I read the stimulus first, meaning I read the argument first, before looking at the question and before looking at the choices. Nowadays, I like reading the question stem first before looking at the stimulus. And I think the truth is that it ultimately doesn't matter a whole lot. There are lots of people who've gotten top scores doing it either way. But I'll give you my argument for why I now like question stem first. It's because the question stem gives you the proper perspective from which to view the stimulus. If you have a strengthened question stem, for example, that tells you this is going to be an argument, there's going to be a gap, and you want to help close that gap. In contrast, if it's a must-be-true question, this tells you it might be a fact set, but even if it's an argument, you're not looking to evaluate the stimulus for any gaps within it. You're just looking to find out what else needs to be true on that basis. If you're not sure which way to go, try out both, do a couple sections one way, do a couple another way, and see what feels better for you, and of course, which gets you more questions right in the time allotted.
For a question that requires necessary versus sufficient, when do you want a diagram? Diagramming could help me, but diagramming also takes up a lot of time.
In logical reasoning, I would recommend diagramming very few question types. Most logical reasoning questions do not lend themselves well to diagramming, and most of them are more informal logic in nature, which means you're really thinking through them in a real world sense. Now, conditionality, of course, does appear. And when conditionality appears to a certain extent, to a certain level, then it does become worth diagramming. But it's only for certain question types. Specifically, sufficient assumption questions, must be true questions, and parallel reasoning questions. Those are the three biggest areas where conditional reasoning comes in, and there's also must be true questions. But this is not all the time. This is only in certain instances. So you really have to look at the specifics of the question and just how many conditional statements are involved, and also to what extent they can be linked together. Hey guys, real quick, a lot of you have been asking me how you can get feedback on your LSAT study approach in one of these breakdown videos. The only way is to join one of my LSAT coaching programs. You can check out the links below to find out more and book a call with me and my team. We'd be glad to help you out on your journey to getting a top LSAT score. And now, back to the show.
I was going to ask you, what are the best habits to establish early on in studying? I am scoring for 170 plus just because of scholarship money and obviously getting into a great school, but I don't want to be making mistakes early on right now.
Of course. Well, one of them, as we said, is the review process, slowing down, doing fewer exams, fewer questions, and reviewing them in more detail. That's a good habit to instill early. And of course, we have plenty of time to put this into practice. So that's great. The second thing I would say is having a defined plan of attack. So you're not just randomly doing exam after exam and measuring yourself. You're slowing down, you're building the foundation first, looking to get a comprehensive overview of each section and question type. So you are approaching this systematically, and I think that's all good. So I would just say keep doing what you're doing, use the best resources possible to learn the basics and learn the proper perspective from which to view each question before simply jumping in.
I'm feeling like whenever I'm reading a lot of the questions, I'm just missing. I'm missing words, or some words that I'm thinking aren't translating. I don't want to be stuck in the swarm of so many different systems.
I think that you risk confusing yourself with different terminologies if you're jumping between different methods. And personally, I try not to use overly complicated terminology or descriptors. I say strengthening questions, let's call it a strengthening question, just to keep it really simple. But yeah, I think if you use the study plan, you just follow that, you're doing the right thing. And then as test day gets closer, you may discover some weak areas you want to focus on additionally to the side. And that's perfectly fine too, of course. It's easy to get overwhelmed when you're first studying for the LSAT because there are so many different question types and so many different methods out there regarding how to solve the different question types. I typically recommend finding one high-quality resource and sticking with it because you may not just need more information, you also need structure and accountability to keep you motivated when the going gets tough. And there's nothing worse than using two different well-reviewed resources that conflict with each other, and you're just there starting off trying to figure out which way do I go, which method do I try. Try the one you click with best, and then if it's not working out, you can consider changing to a different one, but start off with one, stick with it, and follow it for as long as it's serving you. You want to build those good habits from the start with your LSAT prep because you don't want to burn through valuable limited material and worse, waste your time. You probably want to apply to law school this cycle, not next cycle. There's nothing worse than having to push it back a year or more because you were studying ineffectively and inefficiently. So get a good resource, stick with it, get support, and ideally you're going to want to have a personalized day-by-day plan mapping out exactly what to do so that you're not spinning your wheels when it's time to sit down and study. So make sure that you're clear on what you are doing at any given point in time. I typically recommend building the foundation first, establishing those good habits and avoiding the bad ones, getting feedback on what you're doing wrong and why, then introducing timing to work on your pacing, and then pull it all together with full-length timed practice tests.
When we start hitting around 3 months near the LSAT, how many hours should I be putting in, at least at those 3 months? Because I know that school is approaching. I may have an internship, so no needing to do things later at night because I can't do anything in the morning. I tried.
I mean, ultimately, as far as a daily plan, it'll depend on what's best for you. Some people are morning people, some are night owls, and that's totally fine. You just want to fit in the time wherever you can. And as for a weekly time frame, I like the idea of at least really 15 to 20 hours a week. But obviously, everyone has different obligations with work, with school and such. And so try to plan around that. I think even 25 hours wouldn't be too much necessarily. Just spread it out so you don't burn out.
When you're studying for the LSAT, a lot of people recommend a notebook to keep things you got wrong or notes for diagramming. Do you recommend that? And in your notebook, what do you think people should put inside of it?
Absolutely, yeah. So I actually taught a class recently on question review processes. And one of them is to keep a mistake journal or log, as you said, where you articulate your thought process as part of your own review process before you look at other explanations, whether in written or video form. You first analyze what you were thinking in the moment. If you want to take that to the next level, you could actually write out your own explanations as if you were trying to explain the problem to somebody else. I always recommend keeping some kind of mistake journal or error log because without one, it's far too easy to look at the answer key when you're scoring your practice test, say to yourself, oh, I get it now. How could I have been so dumb? And then the thing is, You just move on to the next question, and ultimately, next time around, you do the exact same thing. You make the same mistake on the same question even multiple times because you haven't truly learned the lesson about what you're getting wrong and, of course, why you're getting it wrong. But when you track your mistakes, when you use a method like the Socratic review method, you make sure that you figure out what you're getting wrong and why. You drill deep on exactly which tricks and traps you personally are uniquely prone to falling for so that you can avoid making the same mistake again. So for example, in logical reasoning, you want to look at, was my mistake in misunderstanding the stimulus, misunderstanding the question stem? Did I fall for a tempting wrong answer? Was I discouraged by an unappealing right answer? Whatever it is, you want to document those key insights, review them, and refer to them regularly to make sure that you are learning the lessons from your review, because every question that you get wrong is an opportunity to learn something new.
When you study for the LSAT, do you try to recreate the environment in which you're going to be test taking? Do you do it quiet, or could there be room for music, study music in the background, just because it keeps me a little bit away?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this comes back to what you were saying earlier about habits. I didn't bring it up earlier because you're not at that stage yet. But as test day gets closer, and I would say we're speaking now with a 6-month timeline up ahead, maybe when you hit the 3-month mark, at that point, you may want to start doing full-length timed exams to work on your endurance and also properly simulating test day conditions. And so part of properly simulating test day means you're not going to have music in the background. You can't pause the clock to go to the bathroom. You can't go to the refrigerator. You can't go get a drink. You can't check your email, right? So as it gets closer, you're going to want to more and more closely mimic proper test day conditions specifically. But if you're just building your foundation right now, if you want to listen to some music, I think that's totally fine. For me, simulating test day conditions is really about when you're doing an individual timed section or a full-length timed exam. That's when timing becomes really important. But for now, if you're 5-6 months out, I would just do whatever's easiest for you right now.
Okay, awesome.
One area that I'm noticing over and over is that I'm missing easy questions that I should be getting right. And I'm getting a lot of the very difficult questions, but I'm noticing that in my practice test that I am missing 1 or 2 of the first 10. And I think it might be because I'm trying to get through those very quickly. And just simple mistakes. They're really not difficult questions, I don't think. And on review, the answer is obvious, but obviously that doesn't mean much in the end.
Of course, understood. Now, it could be that you're getting them wrong because you're speeding through them too quickly. Another possibility that often happens for students is that they end up overthinking them or second guessing themselves on those questions. Is that something you think could be at play here?
Yeah, certainly. One of the tests that I took recently, the correct answer, I changed it, and I shouldn't have, but it was a main conclusion question. And I just changed it after thinking about it twice. And I had originally selected the right answer, but picked the wrong one in the end.
Yeah, it could just be a matter of second guessing yourself. And instead, what you got to do is trust your gut. And so you might try, rather than slowing down on these easier ones, what if you sped up even more? What if you never second guessed yourself? As an experiment, just go through a couple of logical reasoning sections like this and see what the results are like. If you find that you're getting easy questions wrong, but hard questions right, the issue is not with your understanding, the issue is with your psychology. It could be that you're overthinking and second guessing yourself. Sometimes students will say to me, that can't possibly be the correct answer because it's too obvious. And the thing is, in logical reasoning, we already know the difficulty level of the question based on where it appears in the section. There is a general order of difficulty, meaning the questions get harder as the section progresses. So those first 10 questions or so, they're going to be on the easier side. So when you see, say, a question number 4, the answer seems obvious, it's probably because it's an easy question. Pick it and move on. Don't second guess it. Don't overthink it. It probably just is that simple, and it's easy for you because you're pretty good at the LSAT. In contrast, if it's a question number 23 and it seems obvious, you want to give it a second look, a double check, make sure you're thoroughly evaluating all 5 choices, because it could be that A seemed really good to you, but then upon reflection, D also seems really good, and you recognize that actually there was something off about A that makes it wrong. So first 10 questions, aim to complete them in roughly 10-12 minutes. Go with your gut save the time for the tougher questions later in the section that truly need it.
For reviewing question types that I get wrong more frequently than others, do you think that it's helpful to review the most challenging or the easiest ones, or a mixture of both, or kind of the ones in the middle? And how do you determine, do you understand that kind of question?
I think I do. And there's a number of different routes we could go here. I'll aim to paint a picture of all of them, and we could go down whatever road you'd like. So one is that in some of those workshops, I talk about the classic logical fallacies, because you've got to be familiar with the most common flaws that tend to come up, like necessary, sufficient confusion, correlation, causation, of course, ad hominem, and so on. And not every flaw is testing those in particular, but you got to be familiar with those at the very least. You also have abstract language in answer choices for flaw questions, where they are referring to a fairly simple concept, but the vocabulary they're using is so difficult that can make it seem unfamiliar, or that you're not even sure what they're talking about at all. I would always recommend doing that if you have trouble with a flaw question, so that you can at least have a picture in your head. What are they actually talking about here? You also brought up the idea of which questions should you review. And I would say everything that gives you trouble, whether it was an easy question or a hard question, if it gave you trouble, there is something you got to learn from it. Even as simple as the question number 5 you might have trouble with and get it wrong. If it was because you were second guessing yourself, the lesson learned is don't second guess yourself.
One of the things that I struggle with is I flag a lot of questions, and I flag too many questions. So in the end, maybe I'll have flagged 10, but there are 3 or 4 that are important that I go back and actually look at more closely. And so I'm having a little bit of trouble being cognizant of the fact that in the past I flagged all these questions, and it doesn't end up really helping me so much knowing that I flagged 10. Maybe just a little bit of advice on which questions to flag, because you don't have time to go back to all 10.
Yeah, agreed. 10 is too many. Personally, I might flag 4 or 5 in a single logical reasoning section, or let's say 3 to 5. So I think you need to set up your bar a little bit higher as to what is worthwhile to flag. And I'll tell you what I tend to flag, and some of it might carry over for you as well. And by the way, I would flag mostly within the range of 15 and up in a section,
right.
Maybe 14 and up, but the more difficult ones. So tougher parallel reasoning questions, tougher principle application questions, questions on topics that I'm not totally comfortable with. So for me, that might be science, it might be densely worded, philosophy type questions, questions where you're looking at the stimulus and you can't make any headway on it, where it looks like it might as well be a foreign language, where you can't really parse out the structure because you're getting too wrapped up in the topic or too wrapped up in the language, which obviously we want to work to avoid, but LSAT is very good at what they do. So there are going to be a lot of cases where in the stress of the moment, the strict time constraint, it just might not seem workable. But upon reflection with a second look, that might be enough to help you break out of that tunnel vision. It's not like it's just that anything you're not sure of. To me, that's not enough to flag it. But also I could imagine different categories where there's a question where you're not even going to attempt it in the moment because you saw if it's one of those criteria I laid out, versus a question where you were stuck and down to 2. That's a different kind of flagging where, yes, you might want to go back to it, but you might not have enough time to do both the tough ones where you weren't even going to attempt it and also the ones where you're down to 2. In order to avoid getting bogged down or stuck on tough questions in logical reasoning, I love to use the flagging function within LSAC's Law Hub that you'll also have available to you on test day. The idea is maybe there are, say, 3 or 4 questions that seem difficult. They're on topics you don't like. They're question types that you don't like, and you find yourself at risk of getting bogged down or stuck. It's okay. Flag them, skip them, come back to them later, but reserve this specifically for only 3-4 of the toughest questions you encounter. If you're flagging 10 questions, your bar for flagging is too low, and it's not going to be practical for you to go back to all 10 of those and give them all a second look. So if it's easy level, medium level, try to tackle them in the moment. And then for the tougher ones, attack some in the moment, but for the absolute toughest, your personal dislikes, flag them, skip them, come back to them later, but cap it at just 3 to 4.
My next concern is deciding between how much time to spend on RC versus LR. and if I should maybe spend more time on the reading comp section, knowing that I miss about 5 in each of those. Do you think it would be better to really focus on doing the logical reasoning, main conclusion, really drilling those? And if you think there will be some carryover to the reading comp there?
I'm glad you took it there because I was thinking that as well. So yes, there can be some carryover in terms of the benefits you gain from analyzing arguments in LR could carry over to reading comp as well, not only in terms of conclusion, but also in terms of analyzing the structure of an argument. The role of statement, for example, role of statement comes up in both. So if you can find the conclusion in a logical reasoning stimulus, can that carry over to reading comprehension? It absolutely can. The main idea, the primary purpose in reading comp is the same as the equivalent in logical reasoning. Just in logical reasoning, it may be easier to spot because there's less text surrounding that conclusion.
Yeah, and I've noticed that I do have trouble sometimes with the argument part questions in the logical reasoning section, as well as the role of the statement in the passage in the reading comp. There's some crossover there as well.
Yeah, there's definitely work to be done in both areas. And you could even do them side by side. You could drill role of statement in logical reasoning, then do some similar questions in reading comprehension and see how does it carry over. And in your review process, what are the similarities? Hey guys, real quick, if you're just getting started with your LSAT prep or you're looking for a quick refresher, grab your free easy LSAT cheat sheet linked below this video. I've packed it full of concrete actionable tactics you can take and apply to your LSAT prep right away for a quick score boost. And again, it's 100% free. So you can grab your copy below. Again, back to the show.
The day that I took the exam, I was feeling a little tired and definitely anxious. And then during the exam, I actually had a proctoring issue. I took the exam in my office. I work in a law firm right now. And so I took it in a room that kind of looks like this. And the proctor just came through the microphone and shouted at me that he couldn't see me anymore. And it threw me off so bad. And I think I was so upset that it interrupted my thought process. It threw me off a little for the rest of the exam. I guess I was a bit angry that it happened. And
of course,
because he was like messaging me, but he was also talking to me through the computer, asking me to adjust and everything. And I had even asked him if he was going to pause the timer while I was making these adjustments. And he went quiet, and then I got sent to a different proctor, and then nothing happened after that. So I'm not really sure how they resolved it, but it definitely threw me off a bit.
How can we avoid a proctoring experience like what you previously had, given how poorly that went and given how just incompetent that particular proctor was?
Yeah.
There's nothing you can do to guarantee 100% that the proctor won't interrupt you, but at the very outset of the exam, before it even begins, I would recommend emphasizing to them, hey, listen, if you have to interrupt me for any reason during the section, whether it's audio or in the chat, can you please pause the clock?
Right.
And then you could remind them again during the break just to make sure that you're doing everything that you can, because some of them don't realize how strictly timed this exam is or how important it is. They're proctoring tons of other exams, so they're not LSAT exam specialists or anything. That's the biggest thing I would recommend at the start going in. And make sure that you eliminate glare, make sure that you're centered in the camera, that the camera's at a good height for them, and you could confirm all of that with them as well before it starts. So if you shift a little bit left or right, it's not going to make them concerned if they can't see you or anything. Now that the LSAT is administered by Prometric, you have the option of taking it either in person at a Prometric testing center or remotely at home on your own computer. I typically recommend taking the LSAT in person if at all possible, because it removes a couple of potential issues. One of them being technical issues with a bad remote proctor halfway around the world who themselves may have a shaky internet connection. If you take the LSAT at a testing center, you're using Prometric's equipment, you're using their wired Ethernet connection, which is probably more reliable, and you're also not risking issues, or at least as many issues, with the proctor. Now, if for whatever reason you cannot take the LSAT in person at a testing center, but you have to take it at home remotely, I recommend before the exam starts, talk to your remote proctor and say to them, this exam is extremely important and it's strictly timed. If you need to pause me or interrupt me for any reason, would you please pause the clock? Would you please stop the time? Every minute is precious, every second is precious. This, of course, does not guarantee that there will be zero issues at all, but it dramatically reduces the likelihood of there being issues.
I am 10 days away from the LSAT, so how to prepare in these next 10 days. I do work full-time in a law firm as a clerk. I do trust and estate planning. And so I think balancing my work life and then also doing the studying, I did kind of hit a burnout period. I would say this past weekend, I was doing some of my practice exams and I was making silly mistakes. So I wanted to see like what your thoughts were on how to prep, and then also having a bit of burnout, how I should spread it out to where I get kind of re-energized and not make those silly mistakes.
Regarding the prep schedule for the final 10 days, it really is about taking full-length practice tests and reviewing them in depth. So with 10 days, I would suggest maybe doing 2 or 3. I don't think that you need to do more than that. You want to walk in feeling refreshed and ready to go. So I would recommend that you not do anything at all the day before, and that you take your last practice test a couple days prior, so you have time to review it in depth and feel complete on whatever might have given you trouble on that exam. Because the point of these is not to learn something new. At this point, you generally know it or you don't. It's just about resolving any lingering questions and going in feeling strong with good practice test results in those final weeks.
Okay.
Whether you suffer from test anxiety or not, it's only natural to be a little bit stressed the day before the LSAT, the lead up to the official exam day. And so for that reason, I always recommend taking the day before off just to rest, relax, recuperate, watch a movie, go for a walk, work out, take it easy, whatever relaxation means for you. Get a hot bath, get a massage, whatever you like. The idea being you want to go into test day itself feeling cool, calm, confident, and ready to crush it and own this exam. Of course, if it would make you stressed out not to study for the LSAT the day before, you could do some light studying, some light review here and there, but nothing too serious. The LSAT is a test of pattern recognition. It's a skills-based test. It's not a test of memorization, and so last-minute cramming won't really serve you. Keep it light, if anything.
In terms of like certain questions that I notice I still sometimes struggle with or take a little longer with, it's specifically for logical reasoning, the parallel reasoning questions. Those always seem to take me extra time, and I do get them wrong more often than the rest of the question types in logical reasoning. When I usually get to maybe like choice D, I forget what I had inferred from like A, B, and C. And so sometimes I have to go over them again, or I just end up marking the wrong answer. So I wanted to see what your thoughts were on reviewing that particular question type.
It's really important to form an abstracted idea of the method of reasoning in the stimulus. So extracting a general principle and then holding that general principle in your mind as you're scanning through the choices.
Okay.
So just ask yourself as you go through A, B, C, and so on, is this in line with the general principle? Is it that I had in mind? Is it matching the degree of certainty in the stimulus? Is it matching the category of things they're discussing? So all people, most people, some people who X, Y, Z, and they're further qualifying it. Whatever that range is, you want to make sure that it's matching as closely as possible.
One thing I'm working on right now is writing conditional statements from stimuli that don't contain obvious conditional indicators.
Yeah.
And not every stimulus contains those kinds of indicators, and not every stimulus is a conditional kind of a thing. But I'm working on that, and sometimes as I look at a sentence, I have to think really hard and figure out which is the sufficient and which is the necessary. Try to put the sufficient in a smaller box and the necessary in a larger box.
I've got a couple of thoughts for you based on what you've shared. One of them is when you talk about identifying conditionals in stimuli that don't obviously contain them or don't contain indicators, any stimulus that contains an argument can be reframed as a conditional statement. You have evidence, you have conclusion. Even in the absence of any conditional indicators, we can say evidence, arrow, conclusion. So the evidence is the sufficient condition, the conclusion is the necessary condition. After all, they are saying that because we have this evidence, we can, therefore, justify this conclusion.
Okay, got it.
And then this ties in with sufficient assumptions, actually, quite nicely, because some sufficient assumptions contain some big gap where that gap would actually be supplied as a new conditional statement in the answer choice.
Sometimes it seems like the evidences don't connect. And so we have D requires F, E requires F, G requires F. F is our conclusion. And I don't know how to connect D, E, and G so that I can get to F. And so I'm working on that. That's one of my weaknesses in sufficient assumptions, is actually connecting all the evidences.
Yeah, these are among some of the most difficult logical reasoning questions of all. An example would be the wigs question, handmade wigs in prep test 58, if you want to look that one up at some point. That's a really complicated one and probably the most extreme example I can think of, where we've got lots of conditionals and we're connecting them together. We're supplying a new conditional from the answer choice to fill in that gap. But the trickiest thing of all, in my view, is that some of the conditionals they give us end up being irrelevant. They're just filler. They end up not being useful at all for forming that longer chain. So navigating these is a journey. The reason I brought up sufficient assumptions is because some are like this, where we have tons of conditionals. It can get messy, but we also have some sufficient assumption questions that contain no conditionals at all, where it's just evidence, conclusion, both as concrete statements, like they're independent clauses, just two separate independent clauses. And then the correct answer is simply linking them together as if they were a conditional. So here's an example. We could say that it's 1:45, therefore the sun is up. Those aren't really conditional indicators. We don't really have if then, but if we learned as new information that whenever it's 1:45, the sun will be up, that would guarantee my previous argument.
Right.
So the thing is that we're basically just giving a general principle that then fits this specific situation. So the conditional, if it's 1:45, the sun is up, that is new information supplied in the answer choice that, if true, will guarantee the argument when those were just evidence and conclusion separately. Okay. That's it. It's like stupidly simple, but because it's stupidly simple, it's a little bit counterintuitive that it would be the answer.
Yeah.
Not every argument on the LSAT is explicitly conditional or formal logic in nature, but you can frame a lot of statements as being conditional simply by saying that if you have this evidence, this conclusion necessarily follows. Evidence arrow conditional, just as you have sufficient arrow necessary. Now, there are a limited number of common sufficient assumption argument formats. The more familiar you can become with those formats, the more easily you will be able to recognize the patterns and potentially even diagram them if you would like. But some of them are stupidly simple, just like saying evidence, therefore conclusion. If we learned as new information that a broader version of that evidence guaranteed that conclusion, that would guarantee the particular case in the stimulus. Meaning, if evidence then conclusion, therefore, same evidence requires that very same conclusion. If it sounds like I'm restating things, that's because I am. That's how simple these can be, but you've got to drill them by type in order to better recognize the patterns.
Parallel reasoning, I haven't worked on it in depth this week, but my impression as I have struggled through it is that every single word matters. Every single tense matters. Is it future tense, past tense? Every single indicator of certainty matters. Every single detail matters. Is it a positive statement or a negative statement? Is that a fair assessment of parallel reasoning?
Yeah, every word does matter for sure. Past tense, present, future, that all matters for sure. I would think more about degrees of certainty. So always, never, sometimes, probably, maybe, majority, never. All of those degrees of certainty matter a lot. And those are actually, in my view, the easiest to look for.
Sure. Okay.
And then a more difficult one to look for that's probably more important because it's more difficult to look for. Again, they reward us related to how difficult something is, right? So the other thing to look for is the categories of things they're discussing. So some people, all people, the majority of people. Again, it's related to degrees of certainty, of course, but it's more likely to appear at the beginning of the sentence rather than the end. And it's also going to be more of a modifier of, let's say, a pronoun like people. There are two big things I like to look for in a first pass when looking at parallel reasoning questions to match argument structures. Number one, I look for the degree of certainty in the conclusion. Are they saying always or never, which are extreme in nature, or are they saying sometimes, which is moderate, or the majority of the time, most of the time? You want those degrees of certainty to match. The other thing I'm looking for is the category of things being discussed. Are they saying all people, as in all people in the world, or are they saying all students, which is more narrow, or are they saying all students who study for the LSAT, which is further qualified? So you want to match the degree of certainty, and you want to match the scope or category of things being discussed as a first pass to help you knock out a couple of choices, rather than getting lost in the details.